recording started.
Welcome everybody. This is Doug McCall, the International Schoolhouse Network. Pleased to be doing our second webinar in this series on community schools. The title of the session is focused on research evidence, and we have 3 panel members and a moderator who are going to be leading the discussion today, which is great. For those of you who have used the system, you know that we have over 60 people now on this discussion group, which is really pleasing, and it's growing each day. And we're finding, as we've said before, that sometimes a third or a half of the people show up for the live session, but we do know that they are going to the recordings afterwards. And of course, the slides from this presentation will also be up on the webinar archives page that we're maintaining along with the Community Schools Center for Excellence. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over the microphone to Christine Jones, who's Director of the Center of Excellence for Community Schools based in the UK. Chris?
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Yes, I'm the Director of the International Center of Excellence for Community Schools, and as Doug has said, I'm based in the UK, but we're working all over the world. And in fact, we are at the center of a growing network of people who are interested in developing and supporting community schools. We are in regular contact with people from countries from the United States, Canada, through Europe, throughout Africa, and across to Russia and Ukraine. So it's good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I'm sure that people will be listening in at all different times of the day and night. This is, as Doug said, our second webinar. The first webinar is already available in a recorded version on the webinar archives page that Doug referred to in the introductions. That webinar was about community schools and how to build community support and political will. This is our second webinar on a very important subject, I believe, and that is research findings. If you look at community schools, you'll find that they have, as we know, various elements, various parts to them, each of which has been already very well researched. So we know that parental engagement, for example, results in better outcomes for children. We know that a relevant curriculum results in better academic outcomes for children, etc. What we don't know so much about yet is when you bring all these together in a community school, can we expect to see even better outcomes for children? I should talk a little, perhaps, for a moment about what we mean when we talk about better outcomes for children and more effective schools. Because practitioners in different parts of the world have a different sets of priorities for community schools. Very often, of course, we know that they are seen as a brilliant vehicle for bringing democratization into local communities by helping to the children to become active citizens, but also their parents and the wider community, and to become the hub of the community for citizen activization. I've just come back now from Poland, where indeed this is the case with the rural schools, because the schools are often the only public asset available to the community. But also we know that community schools are play a very important role in improving academic outcomes, especially perhaps for those children who are experiencing multiple disadvantage, such as perhaps ethnic discrimination, maybe poverty, maybe in areas of poor job prospects, etc. So we believe that we need to have good quality research on all of these issues to look at what we mean by effective and which aspects of community school performance would we want to research. And I'm really thrilled to be able to say that we have three experts with us today who have either themselves conducted very robust evaluations and research, or have synthesized that of others. We have three speakers, and the first is Professor Alan Dyson from the sorry, I better just say that if you wish to participate, I think Doug has already mentioned this, that if you are listening live to this, you will be able to participate either by speaking and pressing your talk button, or by typing into the chat box at the bottom. You are welcome to offer us information about your own research, or about any observations you'd like to make, or indeed any questions you'd like to ask. I would ask you, though, if you could refrain from doing that until the three speakers have finished. And our first speakers will be Professor Alan Dyson of Manchester University, and he has, I know, done a lot of research into community schools. He's going to talk to us today specifically about research into extended schools in the UK. After that, we will be hearing from Ruben Jacobson of the Coalition for Community Schools in the States, who has brought together extensively pieces of research and evaluation that's taken place throughout the States, and managed to synthesize that for our benefit. And finally, we'll hear from Pam Boyd, who is the Director of Continue Cymru, an NGO operating in Wales, where there is a national government policy for community schools. They call them community-focused schools, and she's going to talk about the official report made by the Inspectorate Service there. So after those three speakers, we'll be inviting your participation. So can I now please ask, I'll just flick on a little bit there. Can I now please ask Professor Alan Dyson if you would lead us in this discussion first. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris, and good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever it is to other participants. I've got about 10 minutes to talk about the English experience, recent English experience in this domain. We have things called extended schools. One of the problems in this field is that we don't have a common language, not even within the same country. Extended schools are what might be called elsewhere community schools, full service schools. I think the Dutch call them Breda School, and the name has changed, but they're broadly in the same ballpark as anything that might go by any of those other names. We have in England a long history of work of this kind. It goes back at least until the 1920s, probably earlier, and it tends to operate in peaks and troughs. So there was a peak round about the 1920s, 1930s in one part of the country. There was another peak sometime in the 1970s. We then went through a fallow phase through the late 70s and the 80s, but in the 90s, and then particularly in the last decade, there was a real flourishing of this kind of work, largely due to government support. We've since had a change of government and the support has diminished, but a lot of the work continues. So that's what I want to talk about, and about the work I've done with a team of colleagues on evaluating the more recent of the English innovations. So what we did, we had a series of demonstration projects and pilot projects starting in the late 90s, early 2000s. The biggest of these, and the one that had the fullest evaluation, was something called the Full Service Extended School Initiative, which ran in the mid-2000s. It ran in about, well, over 100, 150, depending how you count them, schools across the country, and these were schools serving the most disadvantaged urban areas of the country. And they did the classic community school things, offering additional services to children, to their families, and to the community. As that initiative was running, the government took the view that it didn't just want a limited number of schools in the most disadvantaged areas, but to a greater or lesser extent, it wanted every school to be offering access to a similar range of services. And therefore, by 2010, just about every school in the country was doing something that was characteristic of community schools. Now, to varying degrees and to varying levels, but there was well over 90% compliance with becoming a community school across the country by 2010. And I think what the Full Service Initiative and the wider rollout of extended schools, what makes them particularly interesting is that they weren't standalone initiatives. They were part of a much broader government agenda known as Every Child Matters, which was effectively about integrating services for children and families. And that worked at three broad levels. First of all, the government department, the Ministry of Education, became the Department of Children, Schools and Families, and it took on a wide range of responsibilities that were basically about child well-being and not simply about education. That was then replicated at our local authority level, and we've got about 160 local authorities that run services locally, and they were required to integrate a range of services for children and families, to structurally integrate those services. And then at fieldwork level, there was a blossoming of interagency teams working at a locality level, and very typically working closely with a school, or more likely a group of schools that would themselves be offering a wide range of services. So I think the English situation was distinctive for two reasons. One was this was a national initiative by 2010. It involved every school. And secondly, that it was part of this much wider pattern of trying to integrate services for children and families. There's much more I can say about that, but I'll leave that for the discussion. We undertook a series of evaluations of the various pilots, but mainly, and indeed of the national rollout, but the main one that we worked on was the evaluation of full service schools. And again, I can talk in the discussion about the finer graying of the detail of how we did that evaluation. But let's start with what we thought were our findings, and then I'll say a little bit about some of the problems of evaluation and how we went about it. Picking up on what Chris said, our findings were that there were significant impacts from full service schools, and in the national rollout we thought we were beginning to detect other impacts before the initiative came to an end. So there's a lot of positive news, but also some of the more enthusiastic reports of what community schools can achieve we thought were somewhat problematic. And I think what we need is a more balanced view of what community schools actually can and cannot achieve, and therefore what we would need to do to build on those achievements and to complement what they do through other kinds of strategies. But if I run you through what our main findings were. First of all, the strongest impacts from extended schools in England were very much on the most disadvantaged children and their families. And it would not be too much of an exaggeration to say that in some cases, not every case, but in some cases those impacts were quite literally life-changing. In other words, for instance, there were children who were going off the rails, were beginning to lose contact with schools, and the future looked really very bleak for them. But because their schools were able to bring to bear a series of connected services for those children, the children were put back on track, they stayed in school, they might even have some, in our system 16 is a key age for end of schooling examinations. They might well manage to get some end of school examination passes, and then they continue to do something productive, either in terms of staying on in education or training or moving out into some kind of employment. And much the same, I think, we could say for some adults and some families, that we had a number of families that we encountered that were in very serious trouble, were going through a whole range of crises, and the future looked very bleak. But because the school was able to intervene, and because it had a range of services available, those families were stabilized. I have to say there were some cases, as I say, that were life-changing in that sense. I think the more general pattern would be that crisis situations were stabilized, and that probably what would happen is that in future more work would need to be done and more support would need to be available. And that, I think, is one reason why in this country we moved away from the model of the single community school towards the notion of a network of services involving all schools, because we certainly came across cases where individual schools were doing wonderful work with children and families, but those children and families, the children eventually left that school, and there wasn't the same network of services provided by other schools or educational institutions or organizations. So there's something about having a network rather than just a single center that we think we found there. Okay, they were the most dramatic impacts, definitely. We also thought we could detect impacts in terms of the overall school population, that these were positive impacts, and it was something to do with what's sometimes called affiliation, the sense that school children have that they care about their school and their school cares about them, and education matters, and adults are treating them well, and therefore they're more likely to do the things that adults ask them to do. We certainly got evidence of that happening, but it would be too much to say that this was a very strong effect. It was a rather, insofar as we could judge it, a rather weak effect, well worth having, but not actually on its own transforming the way that the school worked, but useful alongside a set of other initiatives. The third finding was the one that, in the kind of area that often attracts most attention, though I think not necessarily properly attracts most attention, but that is simply in children's attainments. In the English system, there is very close monitoring of how whole school populations, subgroups of school populations, and individual children are doing in terms of their measured attainment, that is on tests and examinations. So we did a fairly large-scale statistical study of whether we could find an extended school effect in terms of children's attainments. And I have to say our finding was that we certainly couldn't detect any large effect. If we detected an effect at all, it was a very small effect, and it was in terms of an agenda that in England is called narrowing the gap, which is looking at the gap between children who are have some indicator of disadvantage. The main one that's used here is entitlement to free school meals, which is a very crude measure of low family income. But looking at the gap between their attainment and the attainments of other children in the same school. And we did think we found a small narrowing of the gap, but it really was very small. It was only in some assessments and in some subjects. We certainly did not find a wholesale transformation of attainments in the schools, even though I think we would have dearly loved to find such a thing. It quite simply wasn't there. And there are a number of reasons that we think are implicated in that. I mean, first of all, what the schools were doing was not particularly focused on the sorts of things that children were tested on. And it might, for instance, be very important to provide an accessible health clinic for children, but you wouldn't expect a school's results in mathematics to be transformed simply because the children had access to a school nurse on a regular basis. So that was one reason. Another reason is that our evaluation of the full service initiative lasted 3 years, and it's entirely possible that bigger impacts on attainment will take longer to materialize. So there were kind of two of the reasons why we think we didn't find this big effect. The third reason is that every school in England, just about, was under intense pressure to focus on raising children's attainments. And therefore they were doing all sorts of things in classrooms, and therefore it's scarcely surprising that interventions that were not particularly classroom focused didn't show any additional effect over and above what were turning out to be the really very large effects from the classroom focus interventions that every school in the country was involved with at the time. That's slightly different from the issue of school improvement. So there's one thing which is to do with, do particular children do better? There's another thing to do with, does the population of a school year on year do better? Is the school performance better? And that's what we mean by school improvement. Our finding there was that there was no guarantee from becoming an extended school that a school's performance would improve. And we had some of our case study schools crashed spectacularly during the period. But equally, there were plenty of examples of schools that were both becoming very fully developed extended schools and putting a lot of time and effort into that, and were also improving their performance year on year. So we took from that that at the very least, the two things are compatible with each other. There was at the time a lot of anxiety on the part of head teachers that becoming an extended school might interfere with their work on academic attainment. We had absolutely no evidence of that. But as I say, neither did we have evidence that it was a guarantee of a way of improving school performance. So probably the best judgment we could reach is that becoming an extended school, becoming a community school, doesn't in itself automatically improve performance. But if there are other factors in place that are likely to improve performance, then becoming an extended school at the very least will not harm that and might actually support that. Then the last two main findings that we had was that we were beginning to get some indications of a potential wider community impact. These schools were beginning to have an impact on certain residents in their area that was very positive, again in one or two cases life-changing, that there was some indication that those effects were beginning to ripple out from the first people that the school contacted to wider groups of people. It's therefore not unreasonable to suppose that over time, if the school was able to sustain its work, those effects will become more widespread. But the evaluation was too short-lived to be able to demonstrate that conclusively. And then the last point in terms of what we found was that we did a cost-benefit analysis of part of the study, and we got an economist involved with us to do that. And this is really important because schools in England, and I think in many countries, tend to be judged in terms of their impact on short-term gains, changes in attainment. But there's a much broader agenda, which is to say, well, what's the wider social benefit of schools working in that way? And a cost-benefit analyst can calculate that by turning the benefits that are gained into monetary values, and by turning the resource that has to be employed to generate those benefits into monetary values. And this is the exercise that we did for our study. What we found was that the benefits, the financial equivalent value of benefits was absolutely huge, and we were talking about millions of pounds, huge. But then when you calculated the resource that had to be used and you worked out the cost of that, that was also huge. Most of it was resource already in the school that was used in a new way, but the cost was very great. At the very least, the costs and benefits balanced each other. There maybe was some small gain in terms of benefits, but the real gain was that the benefits were focused on the most disadvantaged children, families, and local residents. So overall, the effect was redistributive. In other words, it was taking from the public purse overall, and it was distributing that to those who might be judged to be most in need. Okay. How did we do this? Now, there's an awful lot to say about methodology, and I'm very happy to talk about that in the discussion. I just want to make 3 quick points on this, though. First of all, that evaluating extended schools, evaluating community schools, is technically extremely problematic, and there's a whole range of reasons for that. But I guess the main ones are that extended schools, community schools, tend to aim at a wide range of outcomes which may not be easy to measure. Each school tends to aim at somewhat different outcomes. The time scale for those outcomes materializing may be much longer than the evaluation. And even if you can track down the outcomes, it's very, very difficult to be sure in a complex multi-strand initiative which strand of the initiative has generated which outcomes or which proportion of outcomes. So there are some really formidable problems which have held back this field, I think, for some time. There's also a problem that a lot of the evaluations, and I would include ours amongst this, are underpowered. They're too short term, they've got too little funding, they can't really go into the depth that they need to go into to deal with those technical problems. Suffice it to say that we used a methodology which I'm sure many people listening will know about, which is theory of change evaluation. There are all sorts of variants of this. The key to it is that rather than simply saying we will look at the nature of outcomes at the start of the initiative, and we'll look at those same outcomes if we can measure them at the end of the initiative, and then we'll see if they've changed, and if they have, the initiative is a success, and if they haven't, it's a failure. Theory of change works in a much more fine-grained way, because what it does is try to trace a pathway between the actions that, in this case, a community school is taking, the impact that that action has in the short term, the medium term, and then long term, and the outcomes that either materialize before the end of the evaluation, if you're lucky, or if you haven't got the time to do that, that you can predict are likely to materialize. And I've put the picture of dominoes up there because mapping out a theory of change is very much like one of those domino games where you set the dominoes up and you push the first one and it knocks the second one and the third one and so on, and eventually you get this long snaking domino and the last domino falls. It's very much about trying to map out how the schools of various activities under the community school, extended school umbrella start those dominoes falling and what each domino in the line is, so that you can begin to predict what happens at the end of the line. Okay, that for now is all I want to say, but there is more information that you can get, and I've put these up so that you can get hold of these if you want. The first one is the research report called the Evaluation of Full Service Extended Schools Initiative Final Report. That's available on the web, so if you simply Google the title, you'll get that. But it is, of course, a technical report. If you're interested in technical reports, that probably is the one to go for. The one in the middle is the book that we produced. And that report is free. The one in the middle is not free, but it is coming up to Christmas, and if you're wanting to buy presents for your aunties and uncles and grandchildren, you might consider buying this, which is the book that we wrote on the back of the Full Service Schools project, which kind of tries to get around some of the technical issues and tries to present a broader picture, and that's called Beyond the School Gates. But then the third one that some of you may be interested in is a recent report, which again you can simply get on the web, you can Google it. It's a step beyond the extended schools evaluation. It's called Developing Children's Zones for England, and it's looking at the phenomenon of the Harlem Children's Zone, Promised Neighbourhoods, and various similar kinds of initiatives internationally, which are built around community schools, but we think go broader than community schools. And it's saying, do these things have anything to teach us in England? And the answer is yes, with certain modifications. We think that they do. But if you're interested in that, if you Google that or you go to the web address below, you can download that for free. And that's my time done. Thank you.
Alan, thank you very much for that report. I found it fascinating. I'm sure that our listeners will as well. There were many points that you made there that really gave us food for thought. Of course, everybody that's in this network are huge fans of community schools. We believe they work, we believe they're effective on a number of fronts. So it was very sobering to hear that some of the claims that we might make perhaps need further investigation before we can feel fully confident of them. I'm thinking in particular of the effects that you noticed on academic attainments of children, taking into account the technical difficulties that you've described. But that's certainly something that I think we need to give more thought to. But I was very heartened to hear that in many other respects you can see that that it's pointing in the right direction, that we can see that there are some benefits to be had, and that maybe indeed it's a bit like the domino effect that you talked about, that we can improve and improve by working together. And was particularly interested in you talking about networks of schools and maybe networks that go beyond schools as well, offering, I think we had one phrase for it, seamless delivery of a multiple of services for children and their families. So thank you very much for that. Before opening it up to further discussion, I think it's important that we can hear from our other two speakers. And Ruben, I know that you have done a great deal to synthesize the evaluation and the research in the States. It'll be interesting to see if what you have in any way reflects the description that Alan has given us, or indeed offers to take it forward in some way. So I'd like to invite Ruben to speak now, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for inviting me to speak today to the group. And indeed, I think that a lot of what I will say resonated from what Alan presented in that wonderful presentation that preceded this one. I work at the Coalition for Community Schools in Washington, D.C. in the United States, which is a coalition of 150 or more national, state, and local organizations that all are supporting more and more effective community schools around the country. Like Alan in the UK, there's a long history of community schools in this country, but a real acceleration in the past 15 years. But not because of the government, mostly because of what's happening at the grassroots level in local communities. I want to speak briefly today about the context of community schools in the United States, the state of the research, present some of the research findings that Chris alluded to in the synthesis that we're working on, and some of the challenges and opportunities, many of which track with the earlier presentation. So in the US, there are about 60 scaled up systems or initiatives of community schools. These are like the networks that Alan was just suggesting, where there's some sort of intermediary that's organized a set of community schools. So we have examples in Tulsa and Chicago, New York, and elsewhere, where there might be a handful of schools all the way to a full school district or a local education agency. We think that there's approximately 4,000 to 5,000 community schools in the U.S. And there's growing school district involvement. School districts are the local education agencies. The best example of this is in Oakland, California, which has, in the last 3 years, become a full-service community school district. They've changed their motto to community schools, thriving students, and are really trying to embed the culture and the structures of community schools, both in the district office as well as in the school site. The Coalition for Community Schools hosts a peer learning network of these scaled-up systems called the Community Schools Leadership Network that meets regularly. And there's significant support for community schools at the federal level. As Alan mentioned, there's the Promised Neighborhoods and Harlem Children's Zone replication that's strongly supported by the President Obama. Secretary Duncan led the largest community school initiative in the country in Chicago when he was the superintendent there. And there's just a real strong emphasis on this place-based work. However, in the United States, states are the ones that are responsible for education, and they and the locals carry most of the financial burden. Some states have expressed growing interest in community schools, but really community schools, as I've indicated earlier, are a local or a regional phenomenon. What do some of these networks of community schools look like? This is from our Scaling Up guide, which you can find on our website, communityschools.org/scaling up. It's some, we'll call it qualitative research that we did with the sites that we worked with, building on how they create, the history of how they created their systems of community schools in local communities. We tried to figure out what that looked like, what some of the common themes were. Most typically, there's this community-wide leadership group, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, that's responsible for the vision, the policy, the resource alignment, and it includes multiple organizations in the community. On the right side, that group is matched with a school site leadership group, including the teachers, the principal, community partners, and most often a site coordinator, and they're the ones on the ground responsible for planning and implementation. Connecting these two groups is an intermediary, which plays a significant role in the community schools in the United States. This could be a school district, it could be United Way, and so on. And they're responsible for planning, coordination, and management, and all these groups work across a set of functions that we have listed there. So what's the state of the community schools research in the United States? Well, research and evaluations are improving is what I've found. most often, when we first started collecting these synthesis, a lot of the earlier reports 10, 15 years ago were annual reports for funders, were just tracking what particular schools were doing, were case studies of individual schools, but evaluations are becoming increasingly sophisticated. People in local communities are developing research teams both at the school site level as well as at the community level. They're using data systems that pull data from multiple sources, be it the police department, the school district, and so on. But there's still a ways to go, and there's certainly a lack of consistency from site to site. So there is this variation in data collection and why everyone is collecting the data that they're collecting. Some of it is for program improvement, and some of it is for evaluation, some for both. Our job here at the Coalition for Community Schools is to try to collect as much of this research as possible and to synthesize it from the many reports. We use that information. It's essential for us for the policy work that we do with the federal, state, and local levels. Unfortunately, there's scarce peer review literature, speaking to some of the rigor that these evaluations have gone through, and we've been working with researchers and local practitioners to encourage them to publish in more peer-reviewed journals so that it gets increasing attention. And we've presented the last couple of years at some national research conferences and have started to see some more peer review. The coalition also conducts some of its own research, qualitative data to explain what the strategy looks like and what people are doing on the ground. For example, we'll be releasing in the next month a set of 4 case studies on early childhood community school connections, so connecting our youngest children with those in the elementary schools, and we're doing some work right now on expanded learning opportunities and times. Learning opportunity and time. So what are some of the research findings? These are included in a new report that we'll be releasing early next year called Proving the Path. We're finding that based on the research that we're looking at across sites, that students are entering school fully prepared to learn. 2 examples. One is the Hoyer Early Learning Centers in the state of Maryland. There's 24 of them around the country. They use community partnerships in a pre-kindergarten program, and the study found that compared to children who weren't participating, 71% of the students in this program were fully ready to enter kindergarten compared to 63% who weren't participants. In Florida, there's a lot of exciting work around early childhood as well, and their program Bridges, which focuses also around the Highland Elementary School, showed similar findings, although even more significant, where 78% of participating students were ready for kindergarten compared to 33% who weren't participating in the program. And again, that tracks against students. It compares students who have similar demographic characteristics. Reports indicate that there's also developed improved work habits and efforts and attitudes towards learning. In Redwood City, California, a recent study that was published in the Center for American Progress showed students developed strong positive attitudes towards work. And an analysis of the community schools in Boston, some of the community schools in Boston under the City Connects model, demonstrate that students outperform comparison school in work habits and in academic effort for students in ages 9 to 11. As Alan indicated, of course, we really want to be able to show improvement in attainment and academic achievement. In the United States, of course, every state has its own assessment, so it's challenging, very challenging to compare across the different states. But we did find in a couple of the places improved achievements. In Tulsa, what they found is high implementing, and I can't stress enough how important it is to be able to track level of implementation, but high implementing community schools outperformed comparison schools by 32 points in math and 19 points in reading. And Cincinnati, Ohio, since we used in the community school strategy, has become the highest performing urban school district in the state of Ohio. We're finding that students, this is one of the recent peer-reviewed journal articles, but in the Schools Uniting Neighborhoods initiative in Multnomah County, Oregon, that's Portland, they found that students who participated in 30 or more days in after-school program were earning more credits, 6.5 credits on average versus 5.3 credits for high school students, and they needed 24 to be able to graduate. The Communities in Schools model of community schools is a national model, and they've done some of the best research, multiple studies, different evaluations, different levels of rigor, very comprehensive, and they have had significant findings about graduation and dropout prevention, and they were reviewed by the Woolworths Clearinghouse in the United States, which has measures a strong level of rigor. And then finally, some new exciting research is showing that there is an increased lifelong earning power and contribution to society. Again, the Communities in School study, they've done a new study on social return on investment and found that for every dollar spent, there's a $11.60 return on investment. And a new upcoming study from the Children's Aid Society in New York had similar findings, and they looked at 2 schools and found a similar rate of return. So some of the challenges in evaluating community schools are very similar to the ones that Alan presented. This is a decentralized system where initiatives differ not only school to school, but community to community. So being able to compare models is challenging. And defining what this model actually is. What are the different components? I think Alan and Chris in her setup said that there's so much going on in each of these schools. Figuring out exactly what it is that's making the difference is challenging for researchers. The unit of analysis is an important challenge, but also an opportunity. If so many of the activities are targeted at the student level, particular services, health services, academic supports for students, it's important to be able to capture both the student and the school when conducting your analyses. And I'm hoping that more places will start using methods like hierarchical linear modeling, which takes all levels into account. I think we'll get better findings that way. Also identifying what a treatment is. Are we measuring after school? Are we measuring health? What is it that's making the difference? Is it the structure of the community school? We need to do more investigating into each of these different components. And actually, we found that there's some PhD students who are helping us break apart what the different parts of community schools and are investigating these different areas, these different components. And then, of course, there's variability in dosage also. Theory of action for community schools is that not every student receives the exact same treatment or sets of supports, but that the supports and instruction and academic instruction, health supports are tailored to individual students and the family needs. So the level of dosage is going to vary. What are some of the implications for moving forward? We need to improve the rigor of our evaluations. I've already suggested that HLM might be one way to do that. We're working on a project to track a set of common indicators at the school and student level. These are, for example, achievement and chronic absence, but also things like health, student behavior, and school climate. We're working with 9 communities at this point to try to track those, again, at the school level. But we want to eventually be able to help communities track this at the student level as well. We need better data systems that can pull data from multiple sources. And we need to invest more in our research. Unfortunately, the budget climate here and across the world is such that if people have $1 to spend, they'll spend it on services and supports, and then the research suffers. And we know that the research is important to be able to help make the case. And then also we suggest that there's just more publishing and presenting of the research on community schools in settings like these, research conferences, and in peer-reviewed journals. And here's some contact information. So it's an exciting time for research. I think we have a ways to go, and we have a lot that we've built on. But I think we'll see some real progress in the next 5 years. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Reuben. Again, a really fascinating a presentation that you give there with many points I think that we can pick up on. It was interesting to hear that you had technical issues that you acknowledge in the same way as Alan, because exactly what is it that's creating the results that we find is something that we obviously need to be able to pinpoint. But interestingly as well that both of you have talked about issues which might well have an effect on policy if we find ourselves in a position to be able to talk to our governments and indeed be able to talk to a range of international agencies. For example, you mentioned the importance of networks and clusters rather than individual schools working alone, seamless delivery of services, and the engagement of a whole range of agencies. So some of these are really interesting points, I think, for us to be able to pick up. But before we go any further, can I just now move to Pam Boyd from Wales, please? Now, Pam, I think you're going to talk to us about one element, I suppose, of what a community school might be able to achieve, judging by the report of your official inspector service in Wales.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I'm also very conscious of the time, if there's going to be any time for discussion, so I'll do my utmost to go fairly rapidly through this, but would obviously be very keen to talk some more to people at another date. Continue Cymru is an NGO, and we work particularly in Wales. I'm just trying to move the slide on, but it doesn't seem to want to do anything. Doug? Okay, thank you. 3 bits that I want to mention today. I want to talk a little bit about the Welsh Government's education priorities, because that is crucial, the context within community-focused approaches. One element of where community-focused working is going in Wales relating to addressing child poverty and narrowing the gap. And then the very recent report from Estyn, which is the inspection service in Wales, looking at how community-focused schools may be doing something to specifically tackle disadvantage and poverty in schools. Okay, so the Welsh Government context first. We work within local educational authorities. There are 22 in Wales, and some of those are very, very small. So we do have issues of levels of capacity and indeed expertise within some of those areas. Trying to remedy that, the Welsh Government is now requesting that our local education authorities work much closer together in consortia arrangements, and we have 4 education consortia that run across the north, the middle to the southwest, and 2 more to the south and southeast. Our education minister, and we have a separate minister in Wales to that, the minister in England, in Westminster, is particularly challenged in relation to the delivery of a world-class education service in Wales, and has some significant concerns that our service is not as good as it should be, and so improving schools and therefore the outcomes for children and young people is crucial. And then the 4th part of the programme is really addressing child poverty, and this may seem a little strange to some countries who may consider that it would be unusual for a country such as Wales to be talking about child poverty, but nonetheless it is important, and I'll explain that a little bit more as we move on. Move on, yeah, okay. The Welsh Government's education priorities at the moment are particularly focused on literacy, numeracy, and reducing the impact of poverty on educational achievement, which is also referred to as narrowing the gap. I'm not going to talk about the literacy or numeracy today, because I want to focus on the 3rd element. I think there is a recognition in Wales that education is more than schools, and certainly from 2005-06 up to this year, there was a real focus on the community-focused development in schools. which are aligned to what has already been talked about in relation to extended schools, full service schools, community schools. And the commitment from our government was to also put some funding specifically into those schools. That funding has now been subsumed into different grants, but nonetheless there is still a push for all schools to be working in a community-focused way. Education outcomes do not just depend on schools, but are influenced by a range of factors, including poverty, family circumstances, housing, health, all have been mentioned already. And if schools are to deliver effectively for children and young people, they need to work with other schools, and we certainly encourage schools to work as clusters, parents in the local community, and of course that range of partners that are out there, those focused on statutory delivery and also the voluntary sector. The second aspect is specifically around reducing the impact of poverty. And the Inspectorate has said that the link between disadvantage and educational and achievement is still strong in Wales. And in general, learners from poorer families do not achieve as well as their peers. And of course, this really is something that we need to address within the country. In relation to what we mean by poverty, the definition that is pretty much accepted across the UK, households living in poverty are defined as those existing on 60% or less of the UK median income. And from 29 and 10, the figures of 60% are £256 a week for a parent on their own with 2 children between 5 and 14, or £346 per week with 2 dependent children for a couple. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's latest figures from last year are that there are 200,000 children seem to be living in poverty in Wales. The report that I just want to talk a little bit about today is this recent report. It's a follow-on report from one done 18 months ago and one done about 2 years prior to that, and it does include specific case studies on schools and what they are doing. And it talks a bit about what we know about disadvantaged learners and what effective schools in challenging circumstances are doing well. And I want to relate that to the community-focused approaches that we are still striving for in Wales. So some of the things that we know about disadvantaged learners, I've said a little bit about child poverty. Alan's already mentioned the free school meals indicator. And of course that is very often the simplistic tool that is used. But we are increasingly trying to help schools to understand that living in poverty is far more than a child being eligible for free school meals. And for those 200,000 children in Wales, that living in poverty is 100% of their experience. And we know that children in disadvantaged schools and communities do have less access to the enrichment activities that so many children in more advantaged areas take for granted. Often have poor attendance. Often they see the curriculum as irrelevant. It doesn't mean anything to them and their experience of life. They're more likely to have additional learning needs, and often have parents who are less interested in their learning and have a negative perception and experience of school. And it is quite concerning that we're still saying that now, we were saying it 20 years ago, and I think that shows that many things haven't changed over that time. We've talked already about health, so they are often less healthy, they're more likely to die young, and they are more likely to be unemployed and to be not taking part in educational training. And we've also found that if they are white working class boys, then they're less likely than any other group to achieve their potential. The report also shows that disadvantaged learners are more likely to do well if the young person does have this belief in his own or her own ability. And not just ability, but resilience and sense of place and sense of belonging. Believes that events result primarily from her or his own behaviour and actions, and that therefore they can change them. Finds school worthwhile, avoids risky behaviours, doesn't experience bullying, has a much more supportive family, and that the wider community also has a belief in education and the importance of education. The report looks particularly at what effective schools, what Eston sees as effective schools in challenging circumstances do well. They say that, well, they do what all successful schools do, but in addition, they create an outstanding positive ethos that allows disadvantaged learners to achieve well. And some of those points that they make are listed here. But there is a whole school structured approach to tackling disadvantage. I think it's already been mentioned that often the interventions are a hit and miss, and not all students who could benefit maybe do have access to sort of things that could benefit them in the same way. But we need to be much better in the use of data and how we interpret it, and actually what is it we want to collect and how we use that to target our resources where they're going to make the most difference. Literacy and learning skills are crucial, and obviously the work that goes on within classrooms on teaching and learning is absolutely essential. But also for children in disadvantaged circumstances, there needs to be a real drive to support and develop social and emotional skills. And some of the case studies show that those schools who have a real focus on that are making a difference. Improving attendance, punctuality and behaviour. Some interesting work around tailoring the curriculum. We do have schools that are secondary schools that have identified that transition from primary to secondary at age 11 in the UK is a time when many children fall by the wayside, and often coming from very small primary schools struggle with a large secondary school. And we do have examples now where secondary schools are reorganising to deliver the curriculum in a way that is much more like a primary school for the first 1 or 2 years. Providing those enriching experiences that we've already highlighted, all those activities that are available outside the formal school day. Schools that listen and help them to play a full part in school life. Often it's those children who are disadvantaged who don't feel that participating and being a part of is what they can do or what they're allowed to do. Engaging parents and carers, we've already said how important that can be. But also this element of developing staff expertise and helping staff to understand what it is that they are addressing and how they can best do that. So what we're saying is that the community focus of schools must support the core role of schools to improve the learning and well-being of children and young people, but actually the potential benefits, again, that we've heard mentioned already, of supporting and helping to address the needs of families and wider communities as well. That's the end of my presentation for today. I'm more than happy to answer the questions if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pam. Again, a very interesting report, and very practical, if I may say so, with specific pointers there that might help many of us listening to think about the list of activities that we need to be advising our schools to focus on if they're going to help particularly the more disadvantaged children in our schools. I'm conscious that the time is going on and that we've gone over the hour that we said we would spend, but I do want, before wrapping up, just to invite anybody who is listening now to participate in any way. If anybody would like to make an observation or offer their own experience, or indeed if they want to speak directly to us, just if you click on the talk button at the top, or if you prefer, type something into the chat box at the bottom. Now, I'm not able to see the chat box at the bottom for some technical reason, but Doug, you can. Can you tell me if anybody has written in?
Yes, Hal Lawson has added a comment that's quite lengthy, so I'm going to have to try to summarize it as I read it, but he's gained two main impressions. The first is that this work is framed by a dominant institutional framework for school, advantageous in some respects, but also as a constraint in terms of how we're seeing this process work forward, and maybe even a significant obstacle because of the sort of institutional design or bureaucratic need. That's my word. The second impression is that we risk category areas when we conflate, because these schools have more or less the same names, what amount of different organizational forms. What might we gain in design, evaluation, and research if we define and examine these new organizational configurations as interventions, systems interventions, which are complex, and specify their properties and theories of change with a lot of rigor. So I think Hal is trying to reframe this a bit in terms of looking at the normal institutional way we look at schools and broaden it out into more of a process and a complex process. I'm adding that word, and if I might add, I think that's the conversation that's going on in other similar models, similar to community schools in terms of healthy schools and safe schools and so on. And I think our panel members have commented on that too, as they moved away from the school as an entity to looking at the relationships in the community and the systems and working with groups of schools. So perhaps members of our panel could comment on Hal's question or comment, and I apologize for paraphrasing it wrongly if I did so.
Alan, I think maybe this is one that you'd be interested in responding to.
Yeah, I can say something. I mean, first of all, a big hello to Hal. But I think this is exactly right, and I think the history in England has been one where we started out thinking about the school as the focus for services, and that this was what schools would do and how schools would be. And the policy environment, the policy thrust moved towards saying, let's move away from individual schools to groups of schools, and then let's move away from what schools do to a network of services in an area, of which schools are a key component, but they're not the drivers. And certainly the work we're doing now, looking at what we call area-based initiatives, is very much about saying we need an organizational form which is bigger than schools, which includes schools, but is certainly not coterminous with schools. It's something different from that. So I think there is something there. And then I think there's a second part to this, which is there is a problem of using a name. Well, you remember I started by saying there isn't even a single name, which tells you there's something going on here. But there's a problem about assuming that if we call something a community school, it must be doing the same thing as some initiative down the road that also calls itself a community school. And the reality is these things are very different from each other and operate in different ways and have different structures. So I think we would be helped considerably by paying attention to that.
Indeed, and not just the school down the road, but the school in another country. And if my particular interest, as you know, is bringing together people from different societies, different countries, to share their experience, to establish communities of learning so that we can learn from each other. And I certainly can see that just simply from this webinar, the opportunity for people to share the way in which they focus on the issue of research to start with is likely to be one benefit I would hope to see. But definitely, it seems to me that as soon as you start talking about community schools, immediately you understand that you're talking about a more porous organisation, and walls start to come down and activities spill out and in, and you can no longer quite capture it into one organisation, and that's clearly a significant technical difficulty here, but as you say, not insurmountable if it's reframed in terms of this range of interventions. Does anybody else now want to make a comment or speak to us? Doug, can you see anybody else's comments?
Just watching, there's none as yet. Please feel free to either type into the chat box or click on the talk button. I wanted to pick up a little bit on this particular point and add another dimension to it, which is in the Healthy Schools movement. We've been looking at that as well, and there's a language around ecological approaches and how the school and the family and the community are all linked together, and you have to look at all the complex interactions. But we've also really kind of focused in on the school as an entity, and we're now going up a level, looking at agencies and health authorities and school boards and educational authorities in a community. But I think we need to even bump it up higher into looking at government systems and looking at a tri-level kind of process, because schools are the front end of very complex systems, and so we need to think in those macro terms, but also keep driving it down to the practical level. And I think there's a lot to be learned about looking at systems theory and open systems theory, and there's some interesting phrases about open and complex and adaptive systems that are schools and professional bureaucracies and so on. So I think we need to look at and we're learning, at least in the Healthy Schools movement, we're learning now that we really have to revert our thinking and invert our thinking to see schools as being part of something else. Yet at the same time, conversely, I think we also need to really understand what the bureaucratic system of schools is about, and really understand the code that is driving those bureaucracies. They're professional bureaucracies, but they are bureaucracies, and they do have certain mandates that they're going to respect, and constraints they're going to have to face. So I think it's much more of a broader conversation, but and I'm seeing it actually as I watch the research in other fields, in other the Safe Schools movement and the social worker literature and so on. People are now realizing that we need to look beyond one particular unit in the process.
Thank you very much, Doug. So there's a very clear message there, isn't there, about how we frame the research. There are also, I think, very clear messages coming out about exactly what it is that we're trying to pinpoint, and indeed the importance of a whole wide range of impacts on the wider community, on the culture of the school and the wider community, and the importance of that for helping especially disadvantaged children to feel that they belong, to feel that the curriculum is worthwhile for them, and to feel that it's worth carrying on with learning. So there seems to me to be quite an extensive agenda, and I haven't even started thinking about rural schools in many parts of the world which are setting themselves up as the hub of community life. So it seems to me that we have quite an agenda, but top of the list seems to be a plea for governments to see the value of this research and to be investing in it. I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody who's been listening and those who listen to the recorded version later. I hope that you will join us again for the third webinar, which will be on January the 16th. And the focus of that will be on community skills and social inclusion. Some of those topics have been touched upon today, but they will be expanded more in our next webinar.
Maybe Chris, just to use the system a little bit here, and before I go, just to note, I have posted into the chat box the link to, we've created a small group page in the Schools for All website under Community Schools, and that you will find on that page a couple of web tools that I hope we're going to bring into this conversation. One is a Twitter account on Community Schools. If you are on Twitter, if you wanted to follow that account, you can find it on the page, and it is really just a clipping service of research that we pull out of the journals and the websites. We do that for a number of issues, and so it's easy for me to click on the Community Schools Twitter account among several other accounts that we maintain, so you'll find that there. As well, we are starting a bibliography toolbox which people can add to. I will certainly track down the research references from this and start to fill that bibliography toolbox, but if all of us add stuff, then we can all take away more stuff. And then also the participants list is there as well as an agenda of topics for community schools. So if you could follow up on that, that would be great. We're now getting thank yous from Clee and from Kathy from around the world here. That's great. And if you look on your at the section of the page here called Participants, you see a little smiley face, and if you scroll over that, you'll see there's a little applause button. If you could join me in thanking our presenters for this excellent presentation. That little applause will appear next to your name, and I think the presenters have done an excellent job in a tight space of time in really setting out an agenda for research, both what has been done and what has moved forward. So when I see Ruben has smiled back at us, that's great.
Indeed.
So,
thank you very much, Alan, Ruben, and Pam. That was excellent. Thank you very much.
Great. And if people, if you could go under File to exit the room, that would be great. It's otherwise the recording may continue. So please